I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here and get my slide deck up real quickly. So I want to first of all thank everybody for joining me today. It's so awesome to see so many of my friends and family and colleagues here and sharing in this experience with me. It's been a long 3 years from where I started all the way back when, and it's unbelievable to think that I'm at the finish line, thanks in large part to your support. So thank you so much for coming today. And without further ado, I'm really excited to share with you the results and the findings of my dissertation, Accessible Instructional Materials and Disabled Student Success. And a little bit about me, for those of you who don't know me, clearly none of you know me, but I have my bachelor's in political science and history, my master's in communication studies, and I'm excited to be earning hopefully my doctorate in educational leadership this spring after this presentation. And I am currently a full-time instructor in communication studies at Cerritos College, where I also direct the speech and debate team. As far as my positionality within this field of research, I was born deaf. I have pretty significant hearing loss, and so I have lived experience with disability and accessibility. And accessibility is really at the core of what my dissertation is about. I'm going to talk a little bit about what accessibility is up front, but I'm going to go in a lot more detail about it as I go farther into the presentation. But to start things off, I want to talk about what accessibility is, some problems related to accessibility, and then some directions in the literature or gaps in the literature that kind of led me to pursue this project. Accessibility is defined by the California Community Colleges Chancellor's Office as a standard which ensures that students with disabilities, like myself, can use and access their instructional materials as easily and as equally as students without disabilities. And that's a lot to unpack, but what we really mean is when we are thinking about instructional materials, that includes everything from course websites to documents to assignments, videos, graphics, pictures, readings, textbooks, you name it. If it is part of a class and it is something that you can interact with, it is an instructional material. Accessible materials simply mean that students with disabilities can use them just as equally as students without disabilities. So from that perspective, however, let's examine a problem, and that is that in the status quo, a lot of students with disabilities encounter obstacles when their materials are not made accessible. Federal law says that all instructional materials are required to be accessible by default for students with disabilities, but too often this is not the case. Surprisingly, however, in the academic literature, there is not that much that has been written about why it is so important for materials to be accessible for students with disabilities. There's not really a lot of research linking accessibility to student success. And I think there's two reasons for this. Number one, there's not really any work that's been done to measure students' perceptions of accessibility. And this is essentially getting at the question, how do we know when materials are accessible versus when they are not? Another issue is that there isn't really much in the way of quantitative or qualitative findings that examine the role accessibility plays in the student academic experience. So from this perspective is where I'm approaching the need or the justification for the research that I've done. And I pose 3 specific research questions in my dissertation that I sought to answer. The first research question is examining to what extent is a scale or an instrument that I developed for this study called the Perceived Accessibility of Instructional Materials Instrument, a reliable and valid measure of materials that are perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Those four different principles are accessibility principles, which I'll discuss in a little more detail when I talk about the state of accessibility literature. But that's the scale that I developed, and in this study, I sought to test. The second and third research questions are more outcome oriented, meaning they are oriented around, number one, to what extent do the variables of disability type and perceived accessibility predict disabled students' perceived learning? And then the third research question is, to what extent are these relationships moderated or intensified, in other words, by disabled students' use of accommodations and their attitudes toward accommodations? Accommodations are not the same thing as accessibility. Think of accessibility as like a ramp that helps folks in wheelchairs get into buildings. The ramp is built into the structure. It's already there. It doesn't have to be requested. An accommodation would be like if there was no ramp and someone had to make a request to have a ramp built. It's inconvenient, it's a hassle, it takes time. Accessibility makes things available from the get-go. Accommodations help to shore up differences or other issues that might present barriers. So from this perspective, I want to share my conceptual framework for the study, and this comes from two major pieces of literature. I start off with the social justice model of disability, which really emphasizes the role that ableism and disability oppression play in our society. We know that ableism is a force that causes a lot of harm to folks with disabilities, and it is endemic in society at large, as well as within academia, higher education. We also know that ableism influences institutions. And in terms of the rest of my conceptual framework, I borrow pretty heavily from Ku's What Matters to Student Success model. And this model explores institutional and individual factors that predict student success. I was interested in applying this model specifically for students with disabilities, which governs a lot of the choices I made in terms of my research questions and the direction I examined of the literature. But in short, in examining institutional conditions, I posited that accessibility is primarily driven by institutions. As faculty members, we are ultimately responsible for making our materials accessible, and institutions play a great role in supporting faculty to make those materials accessible. But at the same time, there are also individual student factors to behavior or to consider. So the transition to college, when students are considering whether to apply for accommodations or not, whether they even know that they're supposed to do that, that they have to do that, compared to the K-12 system, where schools seek out students and give them accommodations. Even factors such as attitude toward accommodations and what kind of disability someone has might ultimately impact the outcome variable of interest for this study, which is student learning. In short, the conceptual framework essentially positions accessibility alongside a constellation of individual factors which may impact learning and then subsequently promote student success. Based on my conceptual framework, I examined a couple key areas of accessibility literature to try to inform the development of my study. Overall, I found that there's pretty minimal research which examines accessibility and success in the status quo. Essentially, most of the existing research is limited in scope, or it is primarily qualitative. So for example, one older study from 2011 found that a major obstacle for students in online courses was materials that weren't accessible, but that was based on interviews, and it doesn't necessarily represent a generalizable finding. There's also mixed findings regarding the influences of those different individual success factors that I discussed in my conceptual framework, such as disability type, accommodations, and so forth. Essentially, it's unclear whether those factors might promote student success or student learning, and it's also unclear how they relate to accessibility as a whole. Lastly, there's also been very minimal work done to develop a measure of perceived accessibility. prior research to develop such a measure hasn't actually gotten into what it means for materials to be accessible. It doesn't answer the question, how do we know when materials are accessible? So one previous study that did the most work looked at accessibility in different college contexts, like courses and the library and student services, but never really defined what accessibility means. So from that starting point, I sought out a principle or sort of framework for understanding what makes materials accessible. And what I found in the literature is something called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which are the authoritative accessibility principles that are used by website developers in the United States and around the world. Importantly, a lot of scholars have written about these standards and how they might be applied to higher education, but to date, there's not been an effort to actually do that from a quantitative perspective. The WCAG principles include 4 different accessibility areas, and I'm going to explain each one of these. The first area is that of perceivable. Essentially, perceivable materials are materials which students can acquire information just using their preferred senses with. So for example, I'm deaf, so my preferred way of acquiring information from a video is visual in nature. If a video isn't closed captioned, I can't hear what is being said. So perceivable allows students who are either lacking the ability to use a specific sense like sight, hearing, or touch, or just prefer to use one over the other to access information. Operable materials are materials which students can easily use and easily navigate. It essentially deals with how students interact with their materials, whether it is through a course website like Canvas, or whether they're using some sort of program like Adobe or Microsoft Word. In essence, operable materials should be easy for students to use, and it should be logically organized. As a student, I can say there's nothing worse than when I log on to an instructor's website and I don't see anything except one folder with a bunch of documents dumped into it with no structure. That's not going to be very helpful for students with learning disabilities or ADHD or other similar disabilities where that matters a great deal. Understandable materials are materials which are easy to understand, but they also work in predictable ways. Directions for assignments will have a similar structure. And there's other examples, but essentially understandable materials are simple and easy to process. Lastly, robust materials are compatible with assistive technologies. So for example, a student who's blind might use a screen reader. And in order for materials to be robust enough to work with the screen reader, documents have to be tagged with different descriptors or document mapped elements, in other words, like headings, and other requirements have to be met to enable a screen reader to read a document. So these are the principles that I used in order to develop an instrument which measures perceived accessibility. So with all that in mind, let's talk a little bit about the methodology that I ended up deploying for my study. I did make a few changes from when I defended my proposal, so I'm going to explore the methodology again in detail, break out the instrumentation, the characteristics of the sample, and then describe how I analyzed the data. The overall design of the study was quantitative in nature, featuring elements of scale development work, causal comparative elements, and correlational analysis. In other words, trying to determine the relationship between variables across different groups. I used a survey methodology with the online Qualtrics platform to collect data. In essence, I asked students to think about a class that they had taken during the fall 2020 semester, and then I asked them a variety of questions about how accessible they thought their materials in that class were, how much they thought they learned in that class, and then a variety of other questions not related specifically to that class, but just to capture some of the other variables of interest to the study. I worked with 3 California community colleges and 1 CSU campus to collect data. Additionally, based on the trends in the responses, I used supplemental snowball sampling. In other words, spreading my survey via word of mouth and social media to try to get additional respondents. The instrumentation for the study consisted of a variety of different scales. The first scale was the perceived accessibility of instructional materials instrument, and this is the one that I created. I created a 4-part scale representing the 4 different accessibility principles that I discussed. The first 3 principles of perceivable, operable, and understandable had 10 initial items. The robust principle had 7. I went through a scale development process in which I started with the 4 accessibility principles, created a table of specifications to identify sub-concepts within each principle, using some of the WCAG's own guidance for assistance. And I did a variety of what you could call beta tests with disabled colleagues and friends to get a sense of what was working with that scale and what was not, modifying items as I went along. The 37-item scale was then deployed in the Qualtrics instrument. The other instrumentation for variables of interest to the study included disability type, which I measured or asked participants about by using the DSPS statewide disability categories. DSPS is Disabled Student Programs and Services, and that's just an acronym that's used across the system, although some offices, like at Cerritos College, may have a different name for DSPS. Another measure was perceived learning, which included items such as, I can produce a course study guide for future students as a measure of how much students thought they learned in a course. Attitudes towards requesting accommodation, which was an individual factor, was measured using items like, I don't think I am disabled enough to need accommodations. Both perceived learning and attitudes toward requesting accommodation were existing instruments that I drew from the literature. And finally, I measured use of accommodation, which is a simple one-off item. Did you use any disability accommodations provided by your college in the course in question? In terms of the sample, I used non-probability and snowball sampling to gather an initial 222 college students with disabilities. However, many of those students did not progress far enough into the survey to meaningfully contribute to the data. So when I organized the data for analysis, I was unfortunately forced to exclude about 100 of the participants. So ultimately, I was left with about 116 responses that were usable enough for the data analysis. And this is just a breakdown of some of the characteristics of the participants. You can see in terms of disability type, the largest groups or the student with learning disabilities and student with mental health disabilities. Other larger groups included students with ADHD, students with other or unspecified disabilities. The smaller groups included groups like acquired brain injury, autism spectrum, blind or low vision, deaf or hard of hearing, and intellectual disabilities. Students could select more than one of these types of disabilities, which is why if you look at the bar chart, it adds up to more than 116. Because of the way that I had to analyze the data, I was forced to essentially categorize students with many types of disabilities into smaller groups to enable data analysis or comparisons between groups. So I created 3 broad groups of disabled students. One group with learning, cognitive, or mental disabilities, one group with physical or sensory disability, and then one group with 2 or more disabilities of any kind. Almost half the sample had 2 or more disabilities, which is somewhat surprising to me, but is a meaningful group size as far as data analysis. So that's why I decided to separate all those folks out. This is a little bit imprecise. There are other studies in the literature that do this type of grouping, but it is admittedly imprecise. So that is one area to caution about with regards to the results. Participants' institutions range from about half of the sample being from a California community college, a little over a quarter from a Cal State, And then the other 20% was just from the snowball sample and represented colleges from all over the United States. In terms of the gender breakdown, the majority of participants were female. Surprisingly, only 20% were male that we know of. You're also going to see that there's a large unknown group, and that is because the questions for this demographic were toward the end of the survey. Many students just didn't get that far. So it's mostly a female-dominated sample from what you can see there. Race and ethnicity, similarly, there's a large unknown group. The largest plurality was white folks. There were Latino, Latina, Latinx folks were about 21% of the sample, and then you have smaller groups for the other, smaller representation for other race and ethnic groups. So overall, the last sample demographic characteristic is the use of accommodations. So over half the sample reported that they did use accommodations in the class in question. A minority said that they did not, and then about 20% unknown. So that's the breakdown of the sample. So lastly, let's talk a little bit about how I analyze the data. And this is essentially a two-part process. For the first research question, I did a scale development data analysis route, where I started by creating the instrument before even doing the study. So from that initial instrument development process, I had 37 items, which I then deployed in the study. Then I did something called factor analysis or principal axis analysis to separately analyze the items for perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust materials. Ideally, I would have been able to run a single factor analysis on all 37 items, but unfortunately, just because of the limitations of the sample size, I had to analyze each principle separately. Reliability analysis came after factor analysis. So after I identified the items to retain for each scale, then I ran reliability analysis to evaluate the internal consistency among the items for each scale. For research questions 2 and 3, this is where I developed a regression model. In other words, developed a model to see what factors would predict student learning the most. I started with perceived accessibility and did some correlation analysis to see patterns between the different accessibility factors. Then I added additional variables to the model, and to inform those decisions, I ran analyses called multivariate analysis of variance, or MANOVA, and simple regression to look at relationships between disability type, use of, and attitudes towards accommodations in relation to perceived accessibility and learning. And then finally, I created a regression model with 2 different moderator variables using a syntax program called process. So all that said, let's talk a little bit about my findings. And the findings for this study are going to be broken down by research question, much in the same way the data analysis was. In the first research question, I asked whether the scale that I developed, the perceived accessibility of instructional material scale, was a valid and reliable measure of the 4 accessibility principles that I unearthed in the literature. The good news is that when I ran the separate factor analysis on each scale, I created or came up with a unidimensional scale, meaning all of the items that were retained loaded on a single factor. So for example, for the operable scale, 7 out of the 10 items loaded. And what that means is that 3 of the items did not essentially cluster with the other items. They didn't load with them, and so they were omitted. They didn't measure the same thing that the other 7 items measured. In the table, you can see that under the factor 1, all these factor scores are pretty high. They're above 0.6, which was my cutoff for keeping an item on the scale. So we have very high factor loadings, and this was the case for pretty much all 4 of the scales. There were some items removed for the operable scales, and there was 1 item removed for the robust scale, but otherwise all the items loaded. and they loaded fairly highly. What this indicates is that we know that these items are essentially measuring the same thing for each individual step, which means it is a valid indicator of the concept that's derived from the literature. In terms of reliability, this is where things are even better. We have very, very high reliability scores for all 4 of the scales. So typically 0.7 is a cutoff for like okay-ish reliability. All 4 scales had internal consistency scores, Cronbach's alpha, above 0.9, which is excellent. So excellent reliability, internally speaking, for all 4 of the scales. In terms of research questions 2 and 3, so I talked about informing the model that I built, and what I did first is I did a correlation between all 4 of the accessibility factors: perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And I found that all of those factors were significantly and highly correlated. So if you see these numbers here in this little triangle, those 6 numbers indicate the correlation scores, and you can see that those scores went as high as 0.877, which is very high. What that means is all 4 of these accessibility components kind of match up with each other, which has some interesting implications I'll discuss later on. Another issue that I had to look at was the other 3 variables that were of interest to the study. And so I ran MANOVAs and linear regressions and found out that essentially when looking at disability group, use of disability accommodations, and attitude toward accommodations, there are no significant differences or no significant predictive effects toward perceived accessibility or perceived learning, meaning that it's not clear, for example, that what kind of disability you have has anything to do with how accessible you find your materials to be or how much you think you learn in a course if you're a participant. Right? Use of disability accommodations, same thing. It didn't appear that there's any evidence to support that folks who used accommodations scored differently than folks who did not use accommodations on either perceived accessibility or perceived learning. What that meant was that for the purposes of building a model, I didn't consider disability group to be something that might be a significant predictor of learning. So I omitted that variable from the final model. For use of disability accommodations and attitudes toward accommodations, I envision them potentially as being moderator variables, meaning perhaps in isolation, they might not relate to perceived learning, but maybe when they're combined with perceived accessibility, they might contribute to perceived learning. And that was based on some of the literature I'd read way back in chapter 2. So I decided to include those in my model purely from a moderation perspective. And so the final model looks kind of like this. Essentially, X is the independent variable, perceived accessibility. Y is the dependent or the outcome variable, perceived learning. So ultimately, the prediction is that perceived accessibility should predict perceived learning. And I threw in these 2 moderator variables where attitudes toward accommodations and use of accommodations might intensify that X-Y relationship. Ultimately, the results of the model indicated that the overall model was significant. However, the only significant effect or relationship within the model was total perceived accessibility. So in other words, when I took all of the accessibility items and put them into one score, that was the only thing in the model that predicted perceived learning. There were no moderation effects and there were no interaction effects, meaning when you added use of accommodations or attitudes towards accommodations to accessibility, it didn't contribute any significant variance. So there was only a single variable that predicted perceived learning, and that was total perceived accessibility. Finally, let's discuss some of the conclusions and implications from these findings. I've got 3 big takeaways to share with you. The first big takeaway is that the instrument that I developed, the Perceived Accessibility of Instructional Materials instrument, is indeed a reliable and valid measure of perceived accessibility, with the caveat that this is a pilot study. This instrument needs to be refined further, and there needs to be additional development work done in order to make the instrument a little bit better. And that's something that I'll discuss momentarily. But overall, the preliminary tentative evidence suggests that this is a good starting point for measuring students' perceptions of the accessibility of their instructional materials. Number two, possibly the most important takeaway from this study is that we now have quantitative evidence that links perceived accessibility to perceived learning. In this study, the more accessible students perceived their materials to be, the more they felt like they learned in that course. You can see from this scatter plot that there is a line of best fit that runs in a positive direction. So if perceived accessibility increases, meaning it goes farther right, perceived learning increases. So this provides pretty compelling evidence that there's a pretty strong relationship between accessibility and learning. And that has enormous ramifications for how we approach accessibility as a policy priority. My third big takeaway is that disability type, use of accommodations, and attitude toward requesting accommodation didn't matter very much. In my conceptual framework, I thought that these individual factors would play a role, but they didn't. They simply didn't really have much to do with whether students perceived learning in their course. It doesn't mean that that relationship doesn't actually exist. It just means that this study didn't find evidence that it did. Now, let's talk about some of the questions or the conclusions that are raised by this study and some possible limitations. First of all, there may be some issues involving validity with the PAIM instrument as it was written. So while the statistical process of factor analysis was generally indicative that the 4 different scales are reliable, some of the scale development processes might have been better off had they been, for example, simplified a little bit. I think that some of the items could have been simplified. The instructions for the instrument were perhaps a little bit too dense. And one of the ways that that manifested during the study is there was a lot of attrition. A lot of people started the study and didn't finish it. And so I think that that might have to do with perhaps the complexity of the scale. And especially when we're dealing with the population like students with disabilities, simplicity is really, really important. That's something that will need to be re-emphasized with future work on this scale. Another potential question that's raised is, are there really 4 different accessibility dimensions? In my literature review, I found the WCAG accessibility principles of perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. But in this study, they were very strongly correlated. And so that poses the question, are those 4 principles really talking about different things? I'll give you an example. One perceivable principle is that videos should be closed captioned because that allows people who are deaf or hard of hearing to be able to understand information. But what I just said there was understand information. So if the principle of understandable is dependent on someone's ability to perceive information, the lines between those 2 principles start to look a lot more blurred, right? And so I bet that if we ran a proper full factor analysis with all 37 of those items in a larger sample, that factor analysis may not spit out 4 different factors. It may produce something else entirely. And so the conceptual underframing or underpinnings of accessibility may need to be re-examined. A third question is that the timing of the study may have affected the results. In other words, this study was retrospective. I asked students to think about a course they took in the fall, but I didn't ask them to take the survey until this spring. So there's a bit of a lag between when they were thinking about the course and when they actually took the course. And so that may have affected the results, although it's impossible to be sure how or in what way. Lastly, one of the interesting patterns in the data in this study was that overall, the mean accessibility or perceived accessibility score is fairly decent. It was a 4.02 out of a 5-point scale. However, that does not necessarily mean that we should interpret that number to mean that students with disabilities generally find their materials to be accessible. I mentioned the high attrition rate, and that gives us caution that perhaps the students who finished this study are different in meaningful ways from students who did not finish the study. So we would caution, or I would caution against extrapolating the conclusion that students think their materials are accessible just from this one study. Future research is needed to determine that question. Lastly, speaking of future research, let's dive into some recommendations for policy and practice, as well as recommendations for future research. First, from a policy and practice perspective, this study makes clear that accessibility resources are badly needed in order for institutions to promote accessibility. Institutions that are committed to equity have no excuse to not be devoting resources such as hiring accessibility coordinators and promoting financial resources for instructors to gain better knowledge of accessibility and implement accessibility practices. Additionally, instructors as part of the institution need to be supported to make their materials accessible. Accessibility training is a good starting point, and that will enable institutions to help their instructors make their materials accessible to the best extent possible. The results of this study clearly show that given the relationship between accessibility and learning, it's really important to start making those investments on a higher level. Lastly, recommendations for future research. I mentioned that this is essentially a pilot study. This is simply the first iteration of a scale development process that will take, quite frankly, a long time. As I work to further develop the PAIM instrument, I will seek to be refining the items to address some of the wording issues, making the survey briefer to reduce attrition, and also even explore validation work, like, for example, try to see if perceived accessibility aligned with actual accessibility. I could have students take a little miniature demonstration module that's littered with accessibility problems, ask them to take my PAIM instrument and see if the PAIM instrument scores match up with the level of accessibility in that sample module. That's an example of the type of research that could be done to further develop this instrument. We also need to examine the full success picture. In other words, this study only examined the outcome variable of student learning, and it was assumed that student learning is what leads to greater academic success. However, more research should be done to determine if accessibility, writ large, across classes, positively predicts students' academic achievements, such as GPA, graduation, and course completion. All that said, that concludes my presentation. So thank you very much for your time, and I am now open for the committee's questions.
We'll let the committee ask questions, and then if the other guests have questions, we can take those after. Edwin, Dr. O'Toole or Dr. Lewin?
All right, Michelle, do you want to go first?
Yeah, as of now, I don't really have any questions. Any questions I had prior to your presentation were answered in the presentation. I thought it was outstanding. I thought it was comprehensive. It was clear. I knew exactly where you were going. I had no trouble following you and understanding what you were saying, and pretty excited about your results and what you found and what you plan to do.
Thank you.
Yeah, Matt, I will also echo Michelle's comment. I had a relatively long list of questions, and you decided to answer all of that in your presentations. And so, I kind of have to remove. So that's actually a wonderful thing. And I must really, really commend you for a job that is well done. Your paper was very easy to read. You are really precise and concise. And it was clear that you really spent a significant amount of time doing a thorough job. And in fact, your presentation was even stronger. And so, like I said, I would say most of the questions I had, which was more about clarifying, you've already done that. And so I'm going to ask a few more questions for clarifying, and then the last part, I'll just make comments about things that I think you may need to maybe write differently about at the end of your paper. My initial questions were mostly around the WCAG principles, which you really addressed really well. And I think this illustrates the reality that there's some things that may sound theoretically compelling or interesting, but then in the real world, we realize that perhaps people don't have the same ideas as we do when we're writing about this. So I think that was really, really well written, especially, and I was having more an issue around the distinction between the understandable and the perceivable element. So you really did a good job knocking that out of the park. So in defining student learning, could you speak more about that for the purpose of your study? How you defined that and how you presented that to your participants?
So in terms of perceived learning, I used an instrument with essentially two different aspects of learning, one called effective learning and then one called cognitive learning. So cognitive learning refers to sort of like the accumulation of knowledge that you develop through a course, and then effective learning relates to more about like your feelings regarding a course, like were you positively impacted by a course, essentially. And so these two sort of factors were combined to form the perceived learning scale that was used in the study. And this was taken from the Robai et al. 2009 study that I cite in the paper.
Okay. Yeah, so maybe in your write-up, you just want to clarify that perceived learning can be measured in more ways, but you specifically chose those two, which is totally fine. And we don't have to go further with that. And then let's see. Again, with the concern around multicollinearity, which was clear after you collected your data. Now, projecting moving forward, I'm assuming you would be using this instrument moving forward. What would you do differently to address that potential concern?
So I think that in order to, sorry, would you mind repeating the question as far as the concern about what specifically?
Yeah, because after you ran your models, clearly the PAIM skills were highly and significantly correlated, which brings in the potential for multicollinearity. And so I'm wondering, moving forward, what would you do differently regarding to address that potential concern?
So I don't necessarily know that I would attempt to do something like I did in the study where I separated all four of the different instruments, because as you pointed out, if they're highly correlated, that potentially may lead to issues with multicollinearity.
Right.
So in the future, I think what I would try to do is I would try to, first of all, simplify the items, get a larger sample size, then evaluate all of them in a single unified factor analysis, and then determine, okay, are there actually 4 factors being broken out, or are we seeing fewer than 4 factors? And then essentially use the original 4 sort of principles to inform the way that I interpret the factors. Like, for example, if I see that all the perceivable and all the understandable items are loading on the same factor, that is informative, right? That might say that, perhaps we could combine these two and then come up with a new name for that factor. But aside from that, I think it would mainly influence the interpretation of a factor analysis, but that is entirely dependent on the method of the factor analysis being a unified factor analysis as opposed to a factor analysis of 4 separate scales.
That's right. And now you eliminated probably about 100 or so participants who started but didn't complete the survey, right? Now, did the demographic questions come at the end, or such that these participants were not able to fill that section in?
That's correct. So the only demographic question that was at the beginning of the survey was the question in which students indicated what type of disability they had. And the reason that that question was at the beginning was because there was also an option to select, I don't have a disability, in which case those people would have been kicked out of the survey because they were not the population of interest. So that's why that item was at the very beginning. But yes, all the subsequent demographic items were at the end of the survey. And so I just have no idea what the racial or gender or age composition of those participants are.
Right, right. Which also means that you can't draw comparisons between those who excluded and those who eventually made it in.
Correct.
But I'm also curious to find out how does your sample compare to your population of interest? Did you get a chance to take a look at that?
What I can do is I can pull up the DSPS statewide report. The issue I think is that number one, only half the sample was from community colleges, and then number two, because of snowball sampling, I don't really have a great sense as to whether I can compare existing like institutional demographic breakdowns to what I actually sampled. I would say that I can definitely take a look at the Chancellor's Office like data mart sources and see like I can basically look at participants just from specific institutions, like from the 3 community colleges, and then compare those demographics to the overall demographics at that school of a disabled student. But that's not something that I reported yet or did in my study.
Right, and you don't have to go that far. If there were limitations, you probably just want to acknowledge it within the limitation section that we were not able to more accurately compare our sample to what the population looks like, which also has implications as to how we project our findings at the end. So you could simply just acknowledge it in the limitation section, and that should suffice. And then
just really quick, I wrote that down too, Nick. So like I'm thinking just even being specific about like that the population was mostly female and Latinx or white. So that, you know, is a limitation because, well, I mean, I don't know the higher ed world, but in like K-12, most of that's definitely not the population of students with disabilities, like many more would be male. So just definitely something to, yeah, I think that's definitely something to highlight in that section too. So thanks, Edwin, for that comment.
Right. And the other reason this is important is that issues of access to accommodations is a lot of inequity around people's identities. And so it typically happens that folks who have the knowledge to actually interact with those supports come from a very specific demographic background. And so that's just something you want to acknowledge somewhere.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, you wonder if white females are also, I mean, maybe that would have been the majority anyways, but are those the ones that go get ask for the services too? That's something that's, you know, that's interesting also.
Right. Because again, typically you can trace it back to their transition experience in high school. Many of them are folks who are fairly self-determined, who got really great transition supports, and those connections were made when they were still in high school. Something that is not often available to many kids of color. And so it's just something that you probably want to acknowledge. And then clearly your study did not find support for a relationship between disability type and perceived learning. And on the one hand, I'm not surprised, again, primarily as a function of how you grouped the 3 groups. But we know both intuitively and from research that usually is a factor. And so could you speak more about your decision to create the 3 groups?
So I created those 3 groups because essentially, had I not done that, there would have been a lot of difficulty with creating groups that were large enough to have meaningful comparisons. Because essentially, I mean, so I started with 116 usable responses, but then the farther and farther you get into the survey, that kind of collapses down even further. And so had I left the disability groupings intact, that would have meant there probably would have been groups with, 2, 3, 4, 5 participants. It just would not have been viable to compare from a statistical perspective. The other consideration is that it's really difficult to do comparisons for folks who have more than one disability, because you cannot create a group for like the one person who is both deaf and has an acquired brain injury. Like, it just creates too many permutations of disability combinations, and it just isn't feasible to compare them all. And so, sort of like what I mentioned, there are other studies that do this type of grouping. And in my review of literature, I actually criticize their studies because that is very imprecise. And then I do the same thing. And yes, it is very imprecise, and it's not a terribly valid way of assessing disability, the influence of disability. But it's just the best that I could do with the available data.
I absolutely agree with you. And I say this, I don't know if I mentioned to you last time that my dissertation was on a similar topic. And this was one of the massive challenges I ran into. Is that how do you put who in what group based on what? And so maybe that is something you want to highlight as an opportunity for future research. Finding some theoretically sound method of grouping where there's need, because that is a consistent problem. And folks seem to just throw groups, people in different groups. And so that really throws off your analysis when you run it out there, because how do we know, for instance, that there's sound reason to group people with learning and cognitive disabilities in the same category? So yeah, you just want to highlight as an opportunity for further research in terms of finding a more precise way of grouping students based on their disability, where that needs to occur. Right. And then lastly, and this is where probably I'm going to ask you to go take a look at what you wrote and maybe do a little bit of revisions in your recommendations moving forward. Actually, let me step back a little bit before I get to that. I know you did moderation analysis, right? And as I mentioned in your proposal defense, did you get a chance to consider whether these could be potentially mediators and not necessarily moderators?
So I did not consider mediation in this study.
Okay. Yeah, because, well, the good news though is that if you were to do a mediation analysis, you'd probably run similar models. And so I would anticipate, given what I saw in your paper, that they're not mediators. I was just curious to see how you made the decision to look for moderation as opposed to mediation in this case. So nothing that you need to change, but just something interesting to keeping in mind. Suppose you want to publish this work, and that may be something you just want to find a way to address at some point. Yes, and then lastly, with your recommendations, my primary issue here is that I'd like for you to make recommendations within the scope of your findings. I think there are a few areas where you may have maybe extended yourself a little bit. For example, you talk about recommendations about professional development and how resources should be committed. Now, while those are agreeable in general, but I couldn't quite make the link between what you found and how that speaks to very specific recommendation about professional development, for example. Yeah, so my overall comment for that section is that just to go take a look at a little again, and then try to keep your recommendations within the scope of your specific findings. I'm a very strong proponent of the need to be measured with dissertation studies, because this is one great single study. There's still more work to be done. And so it's okay to be measured with your recommendations, because this is, as you say, this is a pilot study. So just go take a look at it, and then just make sure that your recommendations are closely aligned with what you actually found in your study. But other than that, I thought this was fantastic. I really, really enjoyed reading your paper, and I strongly recommend that you turn this around into publications. And if you like support with that, we'd be more than happy to support you through that. So again, thank you for doing a really, really good job.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
I do have something that, as Dr. Ochoa was talking, did dawn on me. In your presentation, you listed the recommendations, but in your paper, you listed the potential of this to be used from a faculty perspective, as opposed to by faculty, as opposed to by students, or as a more of a practical issue on how to adjust accessibility in those classrooms versus a research issue, looking at what students do and how they behave. So I just think that that goes to Dr. Ochoa's, that maybe that's not, I think there's potential there. That was one of the things I was excited about when I read it, but after listening to Dr. Ochoa, I think there might be a little bit of disconnect between how the results show that that could be used in that way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, certainly. I think, in terms of like why I was thinking that, I think my idea was like, okay, this scale now exists, how it's used. But I think you're certainly right as far as maybe it's best to concentrate the recommendations around the outcomes of the study, beyond just the development of the scale as well.
Yeah, I also think that you could, I think you could still use what you have in your study, but I think what's missing is a very strong statement that your PAIM, what are you calling that? PAIM, PAM, or PAIM?
Same.
Yeah, right. How that you don't have the data to translate that into faculty use at the moment, but that's a potential for further research to be able to do that.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Thank you.
Okay, it looks like our committee is finished with questions. Any questions from our guests? If you have a question, you can unmute and ask.
Hello, my name is Christopher Matthews. My question is, so when the students took the survey and you asked them to choose a course from the fall of 2020, did they choose a course at random, or did they choose more than one course?
That's a great question. So the instructions asked the students to think about the courses that they had taken and then choose the course where they best remembered using, or most remembered using, electronic instructional materials as part of the course. So it was only one course. It was essentially, I don't want to say random, it was purposive, but there were instructions for students for how to select a course.
Thank you, Nick.
Other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. Hi, this is Kimberly Rosenfeld. Great job, Nick, and great topic. I'm curious why you think so many people failed to complete the survey. I was really surprised to see you had to exclude so many. And the fact that they started it says something, right? And then didn't finish. So I wanted to hear just your thoughts around that, and then whether you circled back to any of them to see if they would be willing to complete it or to understand why they stopped where they did.
That's also a great question. So ultimately, I think the high attrition rate was due to a couple of factors. Number one, I think that I probably made the survey too long. I think that if I were to do this dissertation project all over again, I would omit several variables, like the attitudes towards accommodations, because they just took up a lot of items to measure, right? And I think that, given that we're in a pandemic, and given, particularly for students with disabilities, given the population that I'm working with, I don't think that a long survey was necessarily the right choice for me to make. And so I think that that combined with, so when I was looking at the Qualtrics data, or responses as they were coming in, there was like one spot in particular where I could see participants were just dropping out at an elevated rate. And that was the page which explained or defined what instructional materials are. Like it was essentially a summary, but it was long. And so for folks who've worked with surveys before, you probably know that many people who take surveys are not the most motivated to do them. And you know, there wasn't an incentive to complete this survey. And so when you throw a big chunk of text that they have to spend cognitive energy, mental energy reading, you know, a lot of participants are just gonna be like, nah, this isn't worth my time. This is too, you know, this just isn't worth it. So I think that in retrospect, probably I should have made the instructions a lot briefer or found a way to compartmentalize that better, because that seemed to be the place where most participants were getting stuck or just weren't continuing. So I think it had mainly to do with the length of the survey, and then there were some specific spots in the survey that were troublesome for students.
Thanks, Nick.
You're welcome.
Any other questions? This part's a little awkward on Zoom. I just want to make sure everyone gets a chance to ask a question if they have one, and I can't see people, and so it's hard to read. But it seems like it doesn't look, but it seems like there are no more questions. So if that's the case, Charlene, do you want to go ahead and put the committee members? Okay, great, thank you. We will be back. See you in a minute.
Well, thank you everybody so much for coming. So the committee is just going to deliberate for a few minutes and then they'll pull me into the room. But I really appreciate y'all being here and your support. Hey, Mom and Dad. Good. Glad to see you. Grandma Sue, I see you came as well. You were able to make it?
Nick, I do have a question.
Yes, go for it.
This is Grandma. Of the 150 subjects that you boiled down to, what was their range and what schools did they attend? Were they all in Long Beach?
So when I did the survey, I worked with 3 different California community colleges, and 2 of them were in Southern California, so in this area, and then 1 was up in the Fresno area. And then I also worked with one of the Cal States, yeah. So
Oh, great, okay.
It was from a variety of different schools, and then I put the survey on the internet and got a bunch of other responses from other schools too. So lots of different schools were represented.
Thank you. It was great to see you.
Yeah, good to hear from you too. Yes, you were allowed to turn on the cameras, show support to me. Hey, Brooke. Hey, Jess, good to see you.
Hey,
Thanks for
Nick,
coming.
great job. Wonderful job. I'm so happy for you.
Thank you.
Same here. You did a wonderful job.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, especially since, you know, I'm one of those students that probably would have taken your survey too. As a person with a disability, specifically blindness, I think there really needs to be a lot of research out there.
Mhm.
So especially during this time where a lot of people are shifting to online education, it's pretty wild what people have created and are being trained on.
Yeah, when the pandemic hit, my first thought was, holy crap, how am I going to do my dissertation? And then my second thought was, holy crap, how am I not going to do my dissertation? Like now we're all online, and like this is like a perfect storm where accessibility matters more than ever. I mean, it was quite the process. Yeah.
Do you have a question?
Oh,
Oh,
Go for it,
sorry.
Chris.
Yeah, it's kind of a more informal question, but what surprised you the most when doing the survey or getting the results back from the survey?
What surprised me the most? I was told, when doing my dissertation, most dissertations don't find significant results. So I was actually kind of surprised that I did find that, that positive relationship between accessibility and learning. So that was a nice takeaway. I'm being told to join the breakout room, so I will have to go and join them, and I will be right back.
the breakout room? He has to go to the breakout.
Yeah. He's gonna be told how he did.
They already told him he was good. Share screen, all the listeners.
Hi, Chris. Oh, there's your daughter.
Hi, you guys. Are you on mute? You're-
Hi, Lauren.
And there's Brittany.
Hi, Brittany.
Hello. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Figured we'd jump in since everybody's quiet now.
Yeah. It's safe for me to talk.
How are you two doing?
We're surviving.
We're surviving. Yeah, we're okay. We got our vaccinations and just,
Us too.
yeah. Oh, good. That's great. Yeah. So we're very proud of Nick.
So is Mr. TJ.
You should be. Are you getting ready to call the doctor?
Oh, yeah.
Dr. Matthew?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, it's official. Congratulations, Dr. Matthews.
Great. Yeah.
Yay. Yay.
Thank you.
Yeah, really, really great job. I'm so glad all of Nick's guests could be here to have this moment too. He worked hard and it's just amazing. I think probably, I've had several students, but definitely like one of the strongest student I've ever had. And that also the committee said the same thing. We wish we had been that strong of students when we were getting our doctorate degree. So
That's right. That's right.
For sure.
I just wanted to clone Nick, and yeah, congratulations, Dr. Matthews.
yes.
Thank you.
Awesome. All right. So Charlene, we'll just I'm sorry. We just finish up our paperwork and then
Yes, so I mean, this concludes the dissertation presentation. Dr. Nick Matthews, yay, congratulations. So just submit the paperwork to Kim and enjoy the rest of your day and enjoy your weekend.
Okay.
Okay, I know this part feels funny too, like we're just saying bye on Zoom instead of celebrating.
Congrats, Nick.
Yeah,
So
good
exciting.
job.
It's cool. I've got some folks here. In fact, hold on.
Okay.
Hold on. I'm gonna
Keep recording this.
Yay.
So we can
Yeah.
have this.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I'm glad they're all there.
Party now.
Yay!
Oh,
Team Nick.
TJ.
Puppy, yay.
how fun.
Okay, well, you guys celebrate.
Yes, we will. Yes, we will.
We are all there in spirit. Okay.
Take care, Nick.
Okay.
Dr.
Congratulations,
Matthews, take care.